History doesn't repeat, but supply chains do. And if that sounds strange, stay with me, because the next few minutes are going to mess with how you see global trade forever. We talk about oil, we talk about wars, we talk about central banks, but the real power line running through the modern world is quieter. Containers, ports, shipping insurance, trade finance, and the invisible rules that decide what moves and what gets stuck. People throw around a number that should make your stomach drop. Roughly $7 trillion a year in value moving through the global supply chain. And here's the scary part. Nobody truly controls it. Not a single government, not a single company, not even the biggest banks. Everyone depends on the machine, but the machine doesn't belong to anyone. So ask yourself this. If a system feeds the whole world, but no one owns the switch, who holds the power? That's what we're cracking open today. And yes, before we go deeper, if you like these money and history breakdowns, hit subscribe now. Because once you see how this works, you'll start noticing it in every price tag, every shortage, every unexpected disruption headline. And once you understand this, every shortage headline will suddenly make sense. Let's start with a simple image. A phone in your hand, a coffee mug on your desk, a car part on a shelf, even a plain t-shirt. None of it exists in one place. It's not made in a single moment. It's stitched together through a chain mines, refineries, factories, warehouses, ships, trucks, ports, customs offices, insurers, banks, and a web of contracts that most people never even hear about. And if you've never thought about that web, you're not alone. Most people see a product and assume it traveled like a passenger, point A to point B. But goods don't travel like passengers. Goods travel like suspects. They get checked, stamped, insured, financed, scanned, and questioned at every handoff. Sometimes the product is finished, sitting in a container, ready to go, and it still can't move because the paperwork isn't clean. Not because anyone is evil, because the system is built to avoid surprises, and surprise is expensive. So, when someone says supply chain, don't picture a line. Picture a pile of layers, like a sandwich you can't separate without tearing it apart. And the weirdest thing is, this chain acts like a country, but it isn't one. It has borders, ports, terminals, choke points, it has laws, shipping rules, trade finance terms, insurance clauses, it has enforcement sanctions, inspections, blacklists, delayed payments. It has a currency dollars, mostly because that's what the pipes were built around, but it has no flag. Which means when the system breaks, everyone points fingers, and nobody can actually fix it in one clean move. Companies can't fix it because they don't own the oceans, they don't set customs rules, and they don't control geopolitics. Governments can't fix it because they don't run every private port, they don't write every insurance policy, and they don't decide which bank accepts which risk. Banks can't fix it because they finance flows, but they don't drive the trucks, unload the vessels, or run the cranes. And when everyone depends on the same system, small failures stop being small, and shared dependence feels safe until it isn't. This is the part most people ignore, and that's exactly why it controls them. But it's not logistics, it's leverage. It decides what you can buy, how much you pay, and whether your job exists in 6 months. Here's how the invisible control works. A factory can build a product, but to sell it across borders, someone has to trust that the product will arrive, that the invoice is real, and that payment will happen, that trust is not a vibe, it's a contract. So a buyer says, "I'll pay when it ships." A seller says, "I won't ship unless you prove you can pay." A bank steps in and says, "Fine, here's a letter of credit. If the documents match, we pay." Then insurance steps in and says, "Fine, if the ship is damaged, we cover the loss under these conditions." Then compliance steps in and says, "Fine, unless the buyer is sanctioned, or the goods are restricted, or the route is flagged." And suddenly, you realize the supply chain is a stack. Physical movement at the bottom, paperwork in the middle, money and rules at the top, and the top layer can freeze the bottom layer without touching a single container. One missing document, delay. One flagged bank, delay. One insurance exclusion, delay. One compliance check, delay. It's controlled by whoever can turn yes into no with paperwork, the gatekeepers, the ones who can speed it up or slow it down or cut it off. Once you see that, you can't unsee it because the global supply chain isn't just a set of trucks and ships. It's a permission system, and a permission system always has power. Now, let's talk about what changed, because the supply chain used to feel like a miracle. Cheap shipping, just-in-time inventories, overnight air freight, ports running like clocks. It felt like globalization was a smooth highway. Then the world reminded everyone that highways can collapse. Pandemics didn't damage trade. They exposed how tight the margins were. Wars didn't raise prices. They showed that energy, grain, and metals can be weaponized. Trade wars didn't rearrange supply. They proved that politics can slap a cost on a product with one signature. And the scariest lesson was simple. A single port can jam the world. A single canal can freeze a fleet. A single factory can stop a whole industry. That's not a metaphor, that's the real structure. Let me make it painfully real. A modern product is built like a puzzle of tiers. You have the brand at the top, then the main supplier, then the supplier's suppliers, then the raw inputs, and most companies, until very recently, didn't even know the full map. The chain didn't fail because people were careless. It failed because it became unreadable. So a company would say, "We have 2 suppliers," and then one day they learn both suppliers depend on the same tiny factory for one tiny component. And when that tiny factory stops, both backup suppliers stop too. That's how fragile the system is. And when the chain is that fragile, your biggest enemy is not a competitor, it's a missing screw. Remember the feeling when shelves looked weirdly empty? That wasn't panic buying alone. That was the chain failing to absorb shock. A single missing part can shut down a whole assembly line. A single missing chip can stall a car worth tens of thousands of dollars. One weak link becomes the story. We built a global economy optimized for beauty, not for impact. For decades, companies optimized for cost. They chased the lowest wages, they chased the biggest clusters, they stacked suppliers on top of suppliers, all tuned for maximum efficiency. But efficiency has a dark side, fragility. When everything is optimized, there's no slack. When there's no slack, any shock becomes a crisis. And once the crises started coming back to back, businesses did something that looks boring but changes everything. They started pricing risk as a real cost. Maybe, not, worst case, a real number. If a container is late, cash is trapped. If cash is trapped, you need financing. If you need financing, interest rates matter. If interest rates matter, the whole model shifts. So even if a factory is cheap, it stops being cheap if the timeline is unpredictable. And timelines have become unpredictable because the chain is now tangled with politics, sanctions, export controls, inspection delays, sudden policy shifts, shipping reroutes, new security rules, cyber attacks, labor strikes, droughts, shrinking rivers, water levels dropping in canals, one after another. Now add one more reality nobody likes saying out loud. The chain got too long, not long in miles. Long in dependencies, a product might be designed in one country, use minerals from another, be refined in another, turned into components in another, assembled in another, packaged in another, and sold in another. Every handoff adds a chance to break. Every border adds a delay. Every insurer adds conditions. Every bank adds checks, so the system is breaking in a specific way. It's losing the thing markets need most certainty. When certainty disappears, everyone starts building backups. And backups are expensive. And expensive backups push prices up. And that's how the supply chain starts rewriting inflation. And when inflation shows up, politics gets louder. Then politics makes the chain even shakier. It's a loop. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Most people think the winners of globalization are the countries that build factories, the workshops of the world, the places where the products come from. But look closer. The richest players often aren't the ones welding, drilling, or assembling. They're the ones controlling the movement. Transportation, finance, insurance, standards, and the choke points. A factory can be replaced. A shipping lane can't be replaced overnight. A port terminal can't be copied in a month. A global insurer doesn't appear out of nowhere. A bank that funds trade at scale doesn't get replaced by a new app, so the chain creates a hierarchy. At the bottom, labor, assembly, raw production important, but easy to pressure. In the middle, suppliers, components, logistics providers profitable, but vulnerable. At the top, the gatekeepers who set terms, price risk and decide which flows get oxygen, and the oxygen is money. Trade runs on letters of credit, short-term loans, insurance guarantees, and settlement systems that make buyers trust sellers across borders. Without that trust, shipping slows. Without shipping, shelves go empty. Without shelves, politicians panic. So, the people who control the trust layer control the system. And here's the brutal part. When stress hits, control tightens. When risk rises, insurers raise prices and exclude routes. When defaults rise, banks shrink credit. When tensions rise, regulators restrict technologies and block exports. When conflict rises, navies patrol choke points and reroute flows. So the chain decides who wins not by patriotism, but by access. Access to financing, access to insurance, access to routes, access to standards, access to the rules. And if you lose access, you don't just lose trade, you lose time, you lose leverage, you lose growth. That's why some countries get richer without building everything, while others build everything and still feel trapped because the flow matters more than the factory. And watch what happens in the middle of the chain. Where most power hides, shipping companies don't just move containers, they sell time. When demand spikes, time gets expensive, rates jump, spot markets go crazy, and suddenly the cost of moving a box is not a cost, it's the cost. Port operators don't just unload ships, they control queues. A queue can be the difference between profit and loss. Insurers don't just pay claims, they decide which risks are acceptable. If an insurer says, "We don't cover that route," it doesn't matter that the ship exists. The ship becomes a problem nobody wants to touch. Banks don't just finance trade, they decide who is clean enough to do business. If your payment path is flagged, your cargo becomes a statue. So the winners aren't always the loudest countries, they're often the quiet systems that set terms, and think about what that means during a crisis. If you control the shipping capacity, you can raise rates. If you control the insurance terms, you can refuse coverage. If you control the finance, you can make trade possible or impossible. If you control the standards, you can slow down a competitor with audits and certifications. You don't need tanks to pressure a country. Sometimes you just need paperwork and a choke point. And yes, that sounds cold, because it is. Now, I want you to notice something. The system doesn't need to shout to control trade. It just needs rules. But trade isn't free. Trade is governed. It's just governed by rules most voters never see. Shipping is governed by insurance and maritime law. Finance is governed by dollar settlement and bank compliance. Standards are governed by certification regimes and supply contracts. And the biggest lever of all is simple. Who can be trusted? Because global trade is a trust machine. If you don't trust the shipment, you demand insurance. If you don't trust the buyer, you demand a bank guarantee. If you don't trust the route, you demand higher premiums. If you don't trust the country, you demand compliance proof, audits, and political risk coverage. That's why flows get rewarded. The system doesn't reward countries. It rewards stable channels. It rewards whoever can keep goods moving without surprises, and when the system gets nervous, it becomes picky. It narrows. It punishes uncertainty. That's how invisible power looks. It doesn't shout. It selects. You can see it in the small words on invoices, little terms like FOB/CIF, payment at site, payment net 30, documents against acceptance. People treat those words like boring admin, but those words decide who carries risk, who carries cost, and who gets crushed when something goes wrong. It's the same with standards. If you can set the standard, you don't need to ban a competitor. You can just make their product fail a test, or require a certificate that takes months, or demand a process they can't afford. Again, no dramatic speech, just rules. One day your exports clear in 48 hours, the next day they sit in inspection, pending. One day your bank line is open, the next day it's under review. One day your shipping route is normal, the next day the premium jumps and the vessel gets rerouted, and nobody announces it as an attack. It's just risk management. This is where I suddenly realized something. The supply chain is basically a global nervous system, and finance is the pulse. So when people ask, who runs global trade, the answer is messy. No single actor runs it, but the rules run it. And whoever can shape those rules quietly shapes outcomes. And the rules have a personality. They reward predictability. They punish surprise. They love paperwork. They hate ambiguity. They don't care about speeches. They care about documents. So when you hear, we support free trade, remember, the real system is a checklist. Does the cargo meet standards? Does the insurer accept the route? Does the bank accept the buyer? Does the compliance team accept the country? Do the documents match exactly? If one box is unchecked, the flow slows. If the flow slows, the economy feels it. If the economy feels it, politics heats up, and then the checklist gets even stricter. That's the invisible system. So, what happens next? Here's the part you can feel already. Production is moving, but the money flows are stubborn. Factories relocate, assembly lines cross borders, supplier networks reorganize, yet the same pipes of finance, shipping, and insurance keep deciding what is safe. And here's the part that people get wrong. Moving factories doesn't automatically move control. A country can attract assembly lines and still be dependent on foreign financing. A region can build warehouses and still rely on foreign insurers. A company can diversify suppliers and still be trapped by the same shipping lanes and the same settlement rails. So, the shift we're living through is not just about geography. It's about who gets to write the new permission rules as the map changes. That's why the next decade won't be decided only by who builds more factories. It will be decided by who controls the choke points, physical and financial, inside the new regional networks. That's why the shift doesn't automatically make a country rich. It can make a country busy. It can make a country important, but the real gains still go to whoever controls the flow layer, and right now, the world is trying to rebuild the map around risk. Instead of one giant global factory, we're moving toward regions. North America trying to tighten its own loop, Europe trying to tighten its own loop, Asia trying to tighten its own loop. Not because the world is closing, because the world is tired of being exposed, and once regions tighten, you start seeing new pressure points. Nearshoring sounds clean on paper, but it creates new choke points. Friend-shoring sounds safe, but it creates new dependencies. Reshoring sounds patriotic, but it runs into labor costs and capacity limits fast. So the shift isn't a victory parade, it's a messy rebuild. And here's where the who wins story comes back again. Take one real example you can watch in real time: companies moving production closer to the U.S. market. Mexico gains factories, border logistics expand, industrial parks fill, and then quietly Chinese firms show up inside that same move, building capacity inside Mexico to keep U.S. access without carrying the same political exposure. So it's not China out, Mexico in. It's more like the route changes, but the pressure stays. That's the pattern you should watch. The map changes, the rules don't fully change, and the gatekeepers keep collecting the toll. Because when the map changes, the rules get rewritten, and the people who write rules rarely do it loudly. So here's the final reality. The global supply chain is huge. People estimate it in the trillions each year. Everybody depends on it, but nobody owns it. That means crises won't be solved with one button. They'll be managed through leverage insurance, finance, choke points, standards, and politics. So the question isn't, will supply chains break again? They will. The question is, when they break, who gets to decide what moves first? And now I want to hear from you. If the next shock hits war, sanctions, a canal shutdown, a banking squeeze, what do you think becomes the first thing to disappear from shelves? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I use them to pick the next episode. Before we end, I want to leave you with one simple way to spot when the chain is under stress. Don't only watch headlines. Watch the boring signals when shipping times quietly stretch, when insurers quietly raise premiums, when banks quietly tighten trade credit, when companies quietly add clauses that let them walk away. Those are the early warnings. The loud headlines come later. So here's my question for you. Be honest, if you were running a company right now, would you chase the cheapest factory, or would you pay more just to sleep at night? Tell me in the comments, and if you want more stories where history and money collide, subscribe, because the next shortage won't feel like a shortage. It'll feel like the system choosing winners in real time. Next episode, we'll follow one shipment step by step from a factory gate to a port queue, from an insurance clause to a bank document check, and you'll see exactly where trade turns into control. See you there, and if you made it this far, tap like. It helps push this to people who actually care about how money moves, because the scariest shortages aren't caused by scarcity, they're caused by decisions,